remember exactly the moment my life was split in two. I don't think I can put into words what I felt in that moment, or just how many different emotions it left me with. But to give a simple example, when you bite into a lemon, the displeased expression on your face shows that you're uncomfortable. But someone looking from the outside sees only that expression on your face. They don't feel the sourness of the lemon you're tasting. It was a Tuesday morning, quiet and gray, and the city outside our window looked exactly as it always had. Victor stood in the kitchen with his coffee, calm and unbothered, while I stood near the doorway, holding nothing but my phone. He had called his lawyer the night before, and by morning, everything was already decided. The apartment, the accounts, the car in the underground garage, and even the small studio where I kept my design samples. All of it was gone before I had finished my first cup of tea. He looked at me the way a man looks at furniture he has grown tired of, politely, distantly, and with complete certainty that something better is coming to replace it. I did not cry in front of him, and I think that surprised him a little. I picked up my bag, which contained my sketchbook, my 2 favorite pens, and a small photograph of my mother, and I walked out of that life without a single dramatic word. The elevator doors closed behind me, and I stood there in the silence of that descent, feeling the weight of 12 years compress into 40 floors. It was as if I were facing myself here. Every time the elevator reached a new floor, the unease inside me grew a little more. I kept asking myself, why? Wondering where I had gone wrong. Before I knew it, the elevator had already reached the floor where I was getting off. By the time I reached the lobby, I had already begun to think, not about what I had lost, but about what I still carried. And that distinction would turn out to matter more than anything else. I spent the first 2 weeks at my friend Mireille's apartment, sleeping on a fold-out sofa that creaked with every breath I took. Mireille was warm and generous, and she made strong coffee every morning without asking how I was doing, because she understood that I was not yet ready to answer that question honestly. I worked from her small dining table, taking on minor consultation jobs, helping a young couple in the Eastern Quarter choose tiles and lighting for their new home. The work was small, but it was mine, and that ownership felt like oxygen to someone who had been breathing borrowed air for too long. Victor, of course, did not disappear from my life the way I had hoped. He had a talent for presence, for making sure his shadow stretched into rooms he was no longer standing in. Through our mutual lawyer contacts and the polite gossip of the design industry, I kept hearing his name attached to a new project, a new acquisition, a new chapter that seemed to involve erasing every trace of the one we had shared. He had purchased an apartment on the 42nd floor of a newly completed tower in the financial district. A building so new that the paint was still curing and the elevators still smelled of installation and ambition. It was reportedly one of the most expensive residential units in the entire city, and Victor had paid for it the way he paid for everything, without hesitation and without sentiment. I heard about the apartment through Chloe, my lawyer, who had an ear for the kind of information that travels through the corridors of high-rise real estate and expensive litigation. Chloe was the kind of woman who wore quiet colors and said devastating things in the gentlest possible voice. And she had been my legal ally through every difficult stage of the divorce proceedings. As I did what Chol told me to do, I didn't yet realize that the events of the rest of my life depended on that moment. Cole's gaze was stern, She was a woman who took her work seriously, and for some reason I trusted her too much. She called me on a Thursday afternoon, and her tone carried the particular texture of someone suppressing a smile. She told me that Victor wanted a recommendation for an interior designer, and that his new building's management team had made the suggestion without knowing any of the context. The irony was complete and almost theatrical. The man who had taken my career network, my professional references, and 2 years of my brand-building equity had landed on my doorstep through sheer architectural coincidence. Chloe told me I was under no obligation to accept, and then she paused just long enough to let me understand that she also would not blame me if I did. I told her I would think about it overnight, and I spent that evening sitting on Mireille's balcony with a glass of water and my sketchbook open to a blank page. The gentle breeze in the air made the atmosphere very pleasant. The view of the streetlights from above, the slow but cautious steps of people returning from work, and the coal-black hue of the night. It was the perfect setting to clear my mind of idle thoughts. As I examined the curves and patterns of the water glass, my gaze fell upon the sketchbook in front of me. I did not draw anything for a long time. I simply sat there and let the idea settle into its full dimensions, turning it slowly the way you turn a stone to examine every facet. Taking Victor's commission would mean walking back into his world on my own terms, designing a space that he would inhabit and that I would have built. It would mean being professional and composed in front of a man who had reduced me to a line item in a legal settlement. It would also mean something else, something that I did not yet have the full shape of, but that hummed quietly at the edge of my thinking like a frequency just below hearing. I called Chloe the next morning and told her I would take the job. The first meeting happened in a glass-walled conference room in Victor's new building's management office, and he arrived 7 minutes late, which was a number he had always considered to be meaningfully different from being actually late. He was dressed in the particular kind of clothing that announces its own expense without displaying a single visible logo, and he carried the easy confidence of a man who believed that every room he entered rearranged itself slightly to accommodate him. He looked at me across the table with the faintest expression of surprise, as if he had expected me to look diminished and was mildly inconvenienced that I did not. He did not apologize for anything, and I had not expected him to. He explained what he wanted in the apartment with the brisk efficiency of someone dictating a memo, using phrases like seamless integration, an investment-grade aesthetic, and a space that communicates power without effort. I took notes in my sketchbook with my favorite pen, and I asked precise technical questions about natural light orientation, ceiling height, and structural wall composition. He answered when he knew the answer and gestured dismissively when he did not, which told me everything I needed to know about the walls. As you can see, the room wasn't just 4 walls. The walls were a muted brown, a slightly faded brown. Who knows what those walls have seen? What people? What unlived dreams? What events they've witnessed? I left that meeting with a signed contract, a generous project budget, and the quiet, crystalline beginning of an idea that I did not yet let myself fully examine. I walked out into the afternoon light and stood on the pavement for a moment, feeling the city move around me in its usual indifferent way, and I allowed myself one small, private smile before I put my professional face back on and walked toward the subway. The research phase of any design project is where the real work lives, and I threw myself into it with a completeness that surprised even me. I spent 3 days in the architectural records office reviewing the building's structural plans, learning the composition of every wall, the placement of every load-bearing column, and the routing of every utility conduit. I spoke to the building's head of construction, a methodical man named Ferrante, who had overseen the final fit-out phase and who was happy to discuss technical specifications with someone who asked the right questions. I also spoke to 2 acoustic engineers, one of whom specialized in high-end residential sound treatment and one of whom worked primarily in broadcast and recording environments. And I listened to both of them with the focused attention of a student who knows the exam will matter. What I learned in those conversations was both fascinating and, for my purposes, precisely useful. Modern luxury residential buildings, particularly those with steel and glass facades, already presented complex electromagnetic environments. The materials used in premium acoustic treatment, including specific densities of metal mesh, layered reflective panels, and specialized mineral composite layers, had well-documented properties that extended beyond sound management. In the right configuration, applied at the right points within a wall cavity, they could create what the broadcast engineer described with casual technical vocabulary as the advanced acoustic isolation zone. He used the phrase without any particular weight, as a simple descriptor of a known phenomenon, and I wrote it down in my sketchbook in small, careful letters. I want to be precise about what I decided to do and what I did not decide to do, because precision matters when you are walking a line that is very thin and very important. I did not plan to damage anything. I did not plan to install any device, any active jamming technology, or any system that would be illegal to put inside a residential building. What I planned to do was design a space using entirely legitimate, commercially available, professionally standard materials, applied with a knowledge of their secondary properties that most designers simply did not possess. Every element I specified had a manufacturer's data sheet. Every installation technique I used had an industry precedent. I was, from the first sketch to the final invoice, doing exactly what Victor had paid me to do, which was to create a premium interior environment with exceptional acoustic and material quality. The design I presented to Victor 3 weeks later was genuinely beautiful, and I say that without false modesty, because it would not have served my purposes at all if it were not. The apartment's main living area centered on a floating wall structure that would house the media system and create a dramatic focal point for the room. And this structure used a layered cavity system that I specified as part of the acoustic isolation package. The master bedroom featured a wrapped headboard wall with integrated sound dampening that I described as a modern interpretation of traditional Japanese noise reduction principles, which it was technically, among other things. The home office, which Victor planned to use for private calls and negotiations, was given what I called a signal-neutral treatment, using materials chosen for their ability to create what I described to him in our design presentation as a truly focused, distraction-free environment. Victor approved the design in 12 minutes, which was less time than it had taken me to decide what to order for lunch that day. It felt really great to have my design appreciated. It made me feel like things were finally starting to fall into place. I think Victor trusted me. He signed the materials approval form without reading the specifications, because reading specifications was work for people who were not Victor, And he told me the installation timeline needed to compress by 2 weeks because he had a dinner he wanted to host for a group of investors before the end of the month. I told him I would make the timeline work, and I meant it. Because every day of installation was a day that mattered to me in ways I did not explain to him. The installation team I hired was professional and thorough, and they worked from my technical drawings with the careful attention of craftspeople who took pride in doing things correctly. They did not know and did not need to know anything beyond the specifications on the page in front of them, which were honest descriptions of honest materials installed in honest ways. The floating wall cavity received its layered treatment. The bedroom wall received its acoustic wrap. The home office received its signal-neutral composite lining. Applied in a continuous run around all 4 walls and the ceiling soffit, with careful attention to every junction and corner. I was on site for every day of the installation, which is standard practice for a project of this scale and budget, and I walked through the apartment at the end of each day with a clipboard and a flashlight, checking tolerances and finish quality the way a watchmaker checks the spacing between gears. The work was good. The apartment was becoming genuinely stunning, in the cold, expensive way that Victor had requested. All clean angles and considered materials, and the kind of silence that luxury buildings achieve when they are built correctly. On the second to last day of installation, I stood alone in the home office for about 10 minutes after the crew had packed up and left. The room was finished. The walls were smooth and pale, and the ceiling treatment was immaculate, and the whole space had the dense, absorbed quality that good acoustic materials produce, a kind of thickness in the air, a sense that sound did not bounce so much as disappear. I took my phone out of my pocket and looked at the signal indicator in the upper corner of the screen. There were no bars. I put my phone back in my pocket and walked out of the apartment, took the elevator down to the lobby, and stepped out into the evening air of the city. During those hours of the night that I love so much, the crisp scent of the night air filled the air once again. With every step I took, the doubts swirling in my mind about the projects grew. How would it all turn out? How would it end? My excitement just wouldn't subside. What if all my hard work went to waste for reasons too trivial to mention? My phone immediately showed 4 bars of strong signal. I stood there for a moment, feeling the cool air on my face, and then I walked to the subway station and went home to Mireille's apartment, where I sat at the dining table and opened my sketchbook and began drawing the layout for a different kind of project. One that had nothing to do with Victor and everything to do with the future I was now, clearly and with great focus, building for myself. The handover day came on a bright morning at the end of the month. The apartment looked magnificent, and I delivered it with a full presentation, walking Victor through every design decision with the calm authority of a professional who knows her work is excellent. He moved through the space with the particular approval of a man who is more comfortable evaluating things than experiencing them, nodding at the materials, standing in the home office, and looking at the walls with an expression that was almost appreciation. He signed the completion certificate, and his assistant handed me an envelope with the final payment check inside. And we shook hands in the way that people shake hands when a transaction is complete and there is nothing left to say. I thanked him for the opportunity, and I meant it with a completeness I did not bother to explain. I've always believed that the beauty of a project lies in its smallest details. Perhaps because I know that in design, as in life, What remains unsaid is often the most powerful part. I guess I'm also afraid of being misunderstood. I'll explain why later. Part 2, the first call I heard about, came through Chloe on a rainy Wednesday morning. And she delivered the news the way she always delivered good news. Quietly, with her coffee cup raised just slightly, as if toasting something invisible. She said he missed the Harrington deal, Seraphina, and he missed it because nobody could reach him at home. I set my pen down on my sketchbook and looked at her across the table of the small cafe near my new studio. And I said nothing for a moment because the moment deserved a little silence. The Harrington deal, she continued, was a 48-hour window, a private equity group that needed verbal confirmation from 3 partners before they moved forward, and Victor was the 3rd name on the list. And his phone rang 11 times inside that apartment, and 11 times it disappeared into the kind of quiet that expensive walls can produce when they are built correctly. I picked up my coffee and said, "That is unfortunate." Chloe looked at me over the rim of her cup and said, "You are a formidable strategist, Seraphina." I told her I was simply a thorough one. So he must have seen something different in me. Otherwise, why would he say something like that, right? But I think everything is going as usual. It's really hard to guess what's going through his mind, but I'll figure it out. The second call I heard about did not come from Chloe. It came from a man named Bastian, a mid-level property broker who had worked adjacent to Victor's circle for years and who had the particular gift of being present in rooms where important things happened without anyone quite remembering inviting him. Bastian contacted me because he wanted a consultation on a showroom redesign, and while we were walking through the empty space together, he mentioned Victor's name with the casual precision of someone who is testing whether the name will produce a reaction. He said, "You did that apartment on the 42nd floor, didn't you? The one in the new tower." I said I had. He stopped walking and looked at me with an expression that mixed admiration with something more cautious. And he said, "Victor Hale stood in the lobby of his own building for 40 minutes last Tuesday, trying to close a refinancing conversation. And his building manager had to ask him twice to move away from the elevator, because he was blocking traffic." I made a sympathetic sound and asked Bastian what tile he was considering for the showroom entrance, but Bastian was not finished. He said the man paid 8 figures for that apartment, Seraphina, and he is conducting his business from beside a potted plant in his own lobby, and nobody can explain why, and he is absolutely furious. I looked at a tile sample near the window and said, "Some buildings have complex electromagnetic profiles. It is a known phenomenon in premium construction." Bastian stared at me for 3 full seconds and then began to laugh, quietly and with great appreciation. And he never asked another question about the apartment for the rest of the afternoon. The visit that changed everything happened on a Thursday, 5 weeks after Victor had moved in. I was in my studio with Pell, reviewing fabric samples for a residential commission, when my phone rang and the number on the screen belonged to Victor himself. Seeing Victor on my phone screen left me speechless. What was going on? He was the 3rd person to call me today. The ringtone was the kind that grates on your ears. I grabbed the phone in a flash and put it on silent. I guess I wasn't ready to answer just yet. Then I wondered to myself, should I answer? What would they say? Why were they calling so insistently? And I picked up the phone again. I looked at it for 2 rings. Then I answered. His voice had the particular texture of a man who is controlling his tone with visible effort. Smooth on the surface and pressurized underneath. And he said, "Seraphina, I need you to come to the apartment. There is an issue with the installation that requires your attention." I said, "Of course I can come Friday morning," he said. "I need you today." I told him today was not possible, and I heard the breath he took before he said, "Fine, Friday 9 o'clock, and the line went quiet before I finished saying goodbye. Pell looked up from the sample table and said, "Was that him?" I said it was. Pell said, "Are you going?" I said, "Absolutely." I arrived at the apartment at 9 on Friday morning, carrying my professional bag and wearing the particular expression I reserve for client meetings where I need to be the most composed person in the room. Victor opened the door himself, which told me something, because Victor was not a man who opened his own doors when he could avoid it. Today he was acting differently than usual. He was dressed with a sharp, calculated elegance. Her clothes were neatly pressed, and she had a well-groomed appearance. He was dressed impeccably, and his jaw was set in the way it set when he was angry and determined not to show it, which meant he was showing it completely to anyone who knew how to look. He led me into the living room without speaking, and then turned and said, "The signal situation in this apartment is unacceptable. I need you to tell me what can be done about it." I set my bag down and took out my notebook and said, "I understand your concern. Can you describe the specific areas where you are experiencing the most difficulty?" I wish I hadn't asked. The insincerity of the look he shot at me had completely drained my energy. As he adjusted the button on his shirt, he gave a mocking smile. He looked at me as though the question was an insult and said, "Every area, Seraphina, every single room. I cannot make a call from my own bedroom. I cannot work from my own office. I had a business dinner last week where 3 of my guests could not receive messages for 4 hours. Do you understand what that looks like?" I said I understood that must be frustrating. He moved toward the home office and said, "Come here," and I followed him into the room I had lined so carefully with its signal-neutral composite treatment, pale and smooth and acoustically impeccable, and he held his phone up toward the ceiling with the desperate optimism of a man who has performed this gesture many times already. And we both watched the signal indicator sit at 0 with absolute conviction. He said, "Explain this to me." I said, "The materials used in premium acoustic treatment can interact with the building's existing electromagnetic environment. It is documented in the technical literature. The combination of your building's steel facade and the interior layering creates a passive attenuation effect that is difficult to predict precisely at the design stage." He turned and looked at me with his phone still raised and said, "Difficult to predict. You are telling me that you could not predict this." I held his gaze and said, "I specified every material according to industry standards. Every choice was approved on the materials form you signed. The properties of acoustic composites are noted in the manufacturer documentation. I can provide you with all of the relevant references if that would be helpful. The silence in that room was extraordinary. Not empty silence, but the thick, absorbed silence of walls that have been built to receive everything and return nothing. And Victor stood in the middle of it, holding a useless phone and looking at a woman who was looking back at him with complete professional calm. And something crossed his face that I had never seen there before in 12 years of knowing him. It was the particular expression of a man who suspects he has been outmaneuvered, but cannot find the exact point at which it happened. He said very quietly, "Did you do this deliberately?" I said, "I designed your apartment to the precise specifications you approved, using the highest quality materials available, and the result is an acoustically exceptional space that meets every standard in the project brief." He said, "That is not what I asked you." I said, "It is the only answer I have for you, Victor." Another silence, longer this time. He lowered his phone slowly and looked around the room at the beautiful pale walls and the immaculate ceiling treatment and the clean, considered perfection of a space that had been designed with absolute care and absolute intention. And I watched him understand, in the way that intelligent people understand things they cannot prove, exactly what had happened to him and exactly why he would never be able to do anything about it. He said, "Get out of my apartment." He said this in a very loud voice, but there was no need for him to shout. The icy determination in his eyes was more effective than the loudest scream. I didn't want to wait any longer. I picked up my bag and said, "Of course, please do not hesitate to reach out if you have any further questions about the installation documentation." I walked out through the living room and into the hallway and pressed the elevator button and stood there while the apartment door closed behind me with the quiet, definitive sound of a well-made door meeting its frame. The elevator arrived and I stepped inside and the doors closed. And I descended 42 floors in the particular silence of someone who has nothing left to prove to anyone in that building. In the lobby, my phone found its signal immediately, all 4 bars returning like old friends. And I stood for a moment near the entrance and checked my messages and then walked out into the morning light of a city that felt, in that particular moment, exactly the right size. The weeks that followed were the most productive of my professional life. The studio had begun generating genuine momentum, the kind that compounds on itself, where one good project leads to a conversation that leads to a commission that leads to a reputation that starts doing some of the work for you. Pell and I were now working on 4 projects simultaneously, and I had begun receiving inquiries from outside the immediate neighborhood, from young developers and creative professionals who had heard about the studio through the specific word of mouth that travels among people who care about the quality of the spaces they inhabit. I hired a second assistant, a quietly precise young man named Orso, who had a background in materials engineering and who understood immediately and intuitively why the acoustic and electromagnetic properties of construction materials were as interesting as their visual ones. Orso and Pell worked together with the easy collaboration of people who have complementary gifts, and the studio began to feel like something that had found its form. Meanwhile, Victor's apartment was fighting him at every turn. Chloe told me that he had brought in a second telecommunications consultant, then a third, and that the third had produced a report recommending full removal of the acoustic treatment layers in all 4 main rooms at an estimated cost that made the original design budget look modest. Victor had reportedly told the consultant to find another solution, and the consultant had reportedly told Victor that there was no other solution. And that conversation had not ended well for anyone in the room. The decision to sell arrived through Bastian, who called me on a Tuesday afternoon to tell me with barely contained delight that the apartment was going on the market. He said Victor is listing it quietly, no big announcement, and the asking price is about 20% below what he paid, which for that building at this moment is basically giving it away. And the reason everyone in the industry is whispering about it is because the listing description says acoustically optimized interior treatment, which is the most expensive way to describe a problem that anyone has ever tried. I thanked Bastian for the information and returned to the fabric sample I had been reviewing before he called, the viewing that Chloe attended. Through the particular professional coincidence of representing a client who was briefly interested in the property, produced a story she delivered to me in detail over lunch 3 days later. She said, the listing agent was a professional, genuinely trying to present the space in its best light. And the apartment is beautiful, Seraphina. I want you to know that. It is genuinely one of the most beautiful residential interiors I have seen in that price range. I said, thank you, she said. But then the potential buyer tried to call his wife to tell her about the kitchen, and his phone showed no signal, and he stood there for a moment looking at it, and then he looked at the walls, and then he looked at the listing agent. And the listing agent said something about premium acoustic construction and unique signal characteristics. And the buyer said, so there is no phone reception. And the agent said, in certain zones the reception is limited. And the buyer said, in every zone. And the agent said, the building has a complex electromagnetic profile. And the buyer said, I will call you tomorrow. And he never called. Chloe took a sip of her water and said, he sold it eventually, to a man who specifically wanted somewhere he could not be reached, some kind of writer who considered it a feature. I said, that is perfect, actually. She said, I thought you might feel that way. The sale closed on a morning in early spring, and the number it closed at represented a loss that Victor would feel in the specific way that men like Victor feel losses. Not in their daily comfort, but in their standing, in the invisible accounting of who won and who did not, in the long game of acquisition and status that structured his sense of himself. He had bought the apartment as a statement and sold it as a problem. And the distance between those two things was not measurable in money alone. I heard the final number from Chloe at our regular Thursday coffee, and she said it with the same quiet precision she brought to everything. And then she looked at me and said, how do you feel? I thought about it genuinely for a moment and said, like I finished something, and also like I am very busy with what comes next. She smiled and said, that is the right answer. What came next arrived faster and with more force than I had expected. A profile piece in a design publication, longer and more prominent than the first one, focused on the studio's approach to material science and acoustic psychology in residential spaces. And the response to it changed the scale of the inquiries we were receiving in a way that made Orso build a new organizational system for the consultation calendar within 48 hours of it going live. We had requests from 3 other cities. We had a message from a developer who wanted to discuss a full residential building commission, not a single apartment, but an entire floor of units, designed from the ground up with the acoustic and environmental philosophy that the article had described. I sat with that message for 2 days before I replied, not because I was uncertain about the answer, but because I wanted to make sure I was entering the conversation as the version of myself that had learned, specifically and at considerable cost, the difference between building something for someone else's vision and building something that was entirely and structurally your own. I don't think it's right to make decisions like this on the spot. I thought about it for a long time and carefully weighed the possible consequences. Of course, I also felt a pleasant sense of excitement inside. The last time I chose a university, I made a snap decision and later regretted it. Ever since then, I've always taken my time making decisions. But in the end, I'm certain of my choice. When I replied, I said yes. And I meant it with my whole professional self, which was a self I had rebuilt from the inside out in a year that had begun with nothing but a sketchbook, 2 pens, and the absolute clarity that comes from having nothing left to protect except what you actually are. Pell knocked on my office door that afternoon, which they only did when something had come up that they considered worth interrupting for. And they opened it and said, "There is a potential new client on the phone. She says she was referred by Theodora. She wants to talk about a complete studio redesign, and she specifically mentioned that she heard we understand how spaces feel from the inside." I said, "Put her through." And as I reached for the phone, I caught a glimpse through the studio window of the afternoon light, moving across the building opposite. That particular quality of late-day illumination that turns ordinary surfaces into something that seems to know it is being looked at. And I thought briefly and without bitterness of a pale room on the 42nd floor where the walls held their silence and gave nothing back. Then the call connected, and I said hello, and I began to listen, which was, as it had always been, where the real work started. The quietest traps are never the ones that make noise when they close. They are the ones that the person inside them builds themselves, one approved material at a time, in a room they were certain they controlled. And the most complete freedom is not the kind you demand from someone who took it. It is the kind you design, carefully and with great skill, in the silence they left behind. I never told anyone the full truth of what I had done, and I never needed to. The work spoke in the only language that mattered, which was the language of results, of spaces that felt exactly the way they were designed to feel, and of a practice that had been built from nothing on the specific foundation of knowing exactly what you are doing and why. Chloe asked me once, directly and without her usual diplomatic distance, sitting across from me in the studio on a quiet afternoon when Pell and Orso had both left for the day, and the light was doing that particular thing it does in late season, going gold and horizontal across the sample wall. She said, "Seraphina, tell me honestly, did you know exactly what those walls would do?" I looked at her for a long moment, and then I said, "I knew exactly what every material I specified was capable of, because knowing that is my job, and I have always done my job very well." She nodded slowly and said, "And Victor approved every item on the materials list." I said, "He signed the form without reading it, which was also very much his job, and he had always done that very well too." She laughed then, a real laugh, short and complete, and raised her coffee cup toward me, and I raised mine back. And that was the only toast we ever made to the whole quiet affair. Victor and I never spoke again after the morning he told me to leave his apartment. I did not expect to, and I did not want to, and the city was large enough that our paths did not need to cross unless one of us arranged it, and neither of us did. I heard his name occasionally, attached to new projects and new acquisitions, because men like Victor do not stop acquiring things simply because one acquisition went wrong. He continued, and I continued, and the distance between our two continuations grew in the natural way that distance grows when two people are moving in genuinely opposite directions. When he left me, at first I didn't know what to do. I asked myself a million questions about what would happen next. Then I told myself, no, you're a strong, successful woman. You can do anything. All I had to do was believe in myself. What I carried forward from that year was not anger, because anger is heavy, and I had work to do and weight to manage carefully. What I carried forward was knowledge, the specific and applicable kind, the kind that tells you what you are capable of when the conditions are right and the stakes are real and nobody is going to do it for you. I had walked out of a life that had given me everything except the most important thing, which was the certainty that what I built was mine. And I had walked into a year that stripped everything down to the studs, to use a construction metaphor that I find appropriate, and shown me exactly what the structure underneath looked like. It was solid. It had always been solid. I simply had not been living in a situation that required me to know that. The studio completed its first full year with 7 finished projects, 2 ongoing commissions, and 1 signed agreement for the residential building development that would occupy the next 18 months of our work and change the scale of what we were doing in ways I was still in the process of understanding. Pell had become a full partner in everything except the legal paperwork, which was coming, and Orso had developed a specialty in material acoustic modeling that was genuinely rare in the industry, and that I protected and cultivated the way you protect something you recognize as exceptional. On the last evening of that year, I stayed late in the studio alone, the way I had stayed late on that first evening with my sketchbook and my single good lamp, and I walked slowly through the space, looking at the sample wall and the materials library and the project boards covered in the layered evidence of a year of real work. I stopped in front of the photograph of Theodora's 2 children in the kitchen, eating fruit in the last light of the day, and I stood there for a while thinking about nothing in particular, which is the specific luxury of someone who has finished something and has not yet begun to worry about what comes next. Then I turned off the lights and locked the door and walked out into the night. And the city received me the way it always did, without ceremony and without judgment. Just the ongoing fact of itself, moving around a person who was moving through it, quietly and with considerable purpose, carrying nothing she had not earned and nothing she could not keep. The most powerful room I ever designed was 42 floors up, pale and silent and perfect, and it belonged to someone who never understood what it was built from. Everything else I built after that, I built for myself. And the difference, it turned out, was everything. You know what I tell myself when I look back? I'm so glad I mustered the courage and didn't say, I can't do this. Yes, I admit it wasn't easy to walk this difficult path alone. But what you really need to focus on isn't the length of the journey. It's how it ends. My final words to you are, believe in yourself.